Hi, my name is Mary, and I have read 100 books so far in 2019. In this video, I wanted to introduce myself to YouTube. I wanted to get a chance to start talking about some books, and I thought, what better way to do that than to make a video of what I've been reading, what I've been enjoying, and not so much enjoying so far in 2019. In this video, you're going to see the non-fiction books that I've read so far in the year, and I hope in the next video you'll stay tuned to see all the fiction books that I've read so far. Without further ado, I'll get right into the video. The first section I'm going to talk about are classics. I do read quite a few classics, generally speaking, although this year I've been trying a bunch of other genres. The first one that I'll talk to you about was rather a large one that took me quite a while to get through, pretty much the whole month of January, and that is Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. This is a classic French novel which tells the story of some truly miserable characters. And God bless, it is actually Victor Hugo trying to write a social history, but his agent said that he had to add characters or something. Personally, I really love the way that Victor Hugo describes, French culture, French society. I love his little asides about characters, but the characters themselves were a little bit bland. So in the end, I ended up giving this one 4 stars. The next book that I'll talk about is this tiny little one, which I read, that is called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This is the J.R.R. Tolkien translation. The original poem is anonymous. We don't know who wrote it, and it's part of the Arthurian kind of legendary poetry suite. So this one was interesting because it is so archetypal that when I found myself thinking, well, I know exactly where this is going, I had to stop myself and say, there's a reason you know this plot backward and forward, and that is because it has been the basis for so much, especially of English literature. So this one, I ended up giving it 4 stars. I thought it was pretty decent, but nothing to write home about, really. I followed that one up with quite another chunky classic. That is this one, Anna Karenina. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy is the story of 2 couples who are finding out that love isn't all it's cracked up to be. Leo Tolstoy really does have a poor opinion of marriages and relationships between men and women in general in this one. It was sad, but oddly enough, I expected it to be more sad. I would like to read more Tolstoy in the future. This was my first Tolstoy, and I will definitely update when I find another one that, maybe sparks my fancy a little bit more. I think at the time, I gave this 3 stars. So another classic that I ended up reading was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. This is a classic science fiction adventure novel that was high on kind of boring Victorian drudgery. I don't know, I expected it to be more swashbuckling, I guess, but it was written in the 1870s. This is a time period where you have to kind of adjust your expectations for adventure novels. It really wasn't my favorite. It dragged on for quite a bit longer than I had hoped that it would have. I ended up giving it 2 stars. This year, I also read Candide by Voltaire. I was in the mood for a couple of shorter classics after trudging through Anna Karenina and Les Miserables. This is unfortunately one of those novels that at the time was a little bit more remarkable than it is now. It tells the story of a kind of schmuck who goes on an adventure to find El Dorado and gets swindled and taken advantage of and just generally fails at everything that he's doing. I admire that it was a social commentary, but that doesn't really hold up, and it is one of those cases where you really do have to think that perhaps Voltaire is a better personality than he was a writer. So I gave this one 2 stars. Next, I'm going to talk about the category of contemporary. For contemporary, I started reading first this novel, which is called A Man Called Uva by Frederick Backman. Frederick Backman is a Swedish author. This is one of those works that has been kind of a YouTube darling for a little while, and it promises a grumpy but lovable old man who learns the value of family love and friendship with the help of some neighbors. My issue that I have with this novel was that there was no lovable in this lovable grumpy old man. He was just the worst. He was just the worst. So when Frederick Backman writes this character, I was waiting to think, oh, well, he's got a heart of gold under there somewhere, and he really didn't the entire novel. He assaults people, including customer service representatives, when he doesn't get what he wants out of them. He is rude and homophobic even after when he's been corrected. It was a nasty novel, and Frederick Backman also has some problems with fat characters. There's only seemingly a couple of ways he can describe them. They're all unflattering, they're all one-dimensional. I really hated this this novel, I ended up giving it 1 star. Next, I'll briefly talk about When Katie Met Cassidy by Camille Perri, which is a short contemporary romance novel in which our main character Katie has been cheated on by her garbage ex-fiance and therefore has kind of a crisis of whether or not she'll be alone forever. And then she meets the startlingly handsome Cassidy, who is a butch lawyer and is very, very attractive. I will say that this is typically sweeter than I like my romance. I like my romance with a little bit of grit to it if I'm going to read it at all, which I very rarely do. That being said, Cassidy can call me anytime. Katie's also kind of a darling. If that sounds like your cup of tea, then I would say that it is extremely good for what it is, just maybe not entirely my thing. I still gave it 4 stars though. Next, I'll talk about a novel I had a little bit more success with. That is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. This is another YouTube darling that I definitely got the hype for and ended up really enjoying. It's about a young woman who works in a convenience store in Japan in her 30s at a time when everyone else thought that perhaps she should have moved on from this kind of menial labor and moved into the Japanese workforce. But it's a novel about coming to terms with who you are, with what actually makes you happy. And I thought that in the end, although it was short, it was effective and interesting and kept me guessing till the end. And for that reason, I gave it 4 stars. The last contemporary that I'm going to talk to you about is one that I really fell in love with. It is my new favorite contemporary novel. That is Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch. I love this thing. I love this thing so much. It is a wonderful coming-of-age novel about a young man who finds out that after his mother has died, he has lost his moral compass and has to come to terms with who he is without that kind of guidance in his life. It follows him from New York to Las Vegas to New York again to Amsterdam as he endeavors to take care of and find, once he has lost, this painting that you can see sort of on the cover, the goldfinch, which he has come across in a kind of unusual way. I don't want to spoil this one too much because I didn't think I would like it when I first picked it up. I wasn't a huge fan of Donna Tartt's other novel, The Secret History. It was kind of okay, but not great. This one, on the other hand, absolutely fell in love with, and I gave it 5 stars. I used to be a huge reader of fantasy, although I haven't found any new fantasy series that I've really loved lately, so I thought I would dive back into it this year and try some other ones that have been on my plate for a while. Starting off with this big hunkin' monster, this is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. Again, I guess I'm just all up in it with these books that everyone has been talking about recently. This is about some magicians in the early 19th century who are trying to bring magic back to England. They essentially live in a post-magic society. Magic used to exist in kind of the late Middle Ages, early modern period, but now magicians are basically just academics. They just study it, whereas these two men want to bring it back. Unfortunately, I struggled with this one because none of the characters were especially likable. They were all kind of rude and annoying and unfortunate in every regard. This novel was also entirely too long. I know some people really like the Dickensian kind of prose that just continues and drags and drags and drags. Apparently, I don't. Apparently, that's not something that I look for. I ended up giving this one 2 stars. The next fantasy novel that I'll talk about is a much shorter one. That was The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. This is a almost archetypal novel which follows a young man who has been sent from his life as a peasant shepherd to go dig up a buried treasure. And it's about the lessons he learns along the way. This one, it's almost like an allegory. It's almost like a story that you would hear someone tell, maybe to teach a moral lesson that's not high on literary merit, but perhaps is high on, moral content. I didn't like it very much because I didn't resonate with the message at the end. I just thought it was kind of like, okay, it was fine. It just wasn't anything spectacular or amazing, and in the end, I ended up giving this one 3 stars. I also read Laura Esquivel's Like Water for Chocolate, which is a novel in which a young woman's feelings come out in her cooking in unexpected ways. It was more on the magical realism end of the spectrum than perhaps high fantasy, and in that way it reminded me a lot of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Solitude, which is one of my favorite books, and so I thought I would really like this one. The thing is that this one, the central kind of maypole that all the magic dances around, is just a typical love story, and that I really didn't like. I thought it was kind of silly, I thought it was kind of inconsequential, and so in the end, I couldn't end up giving it any more than 3 stars. The next novel that I read in this kind of fantasy genre is China Mieville's The Last Days of New Paris. Now, this is an interesting one. This has a concept that I loved, a concept that really resonated with me, and I'll tell you why. It is about an alternative timeline of World War II in which an S bomb was dropped in Paris. S for surrealist. So it's a novel in which surrealism takes over, infects this area of Paris. I love this idea. I'm very interested in the way that surrealism as an art form takes on a new meaning in an era when the wars, especially the world wars, were changing everything in Europe. And I think that is so fascinating. So, surrealist art, we're all familiar with Salvador Dali and the melting clocks. My favorite is Murata. But the surrealism, it can be dark, it can be scary, it can be funny, it can be interesting and intriguing. And this novel was none of those things. This novel was dry, this novel was confusing, this novel was just not terribly good. And so, in the end, I love the concept so much that what I would give ordinarily a 1-star rating to, I bumped it up to a 2, just for the concept. I wish anybody else could have done it better. I'm an art history graduate student. I also studied history at university, and so you would think that historical fiction would be something that I really, really like. Unfortunately, I don't always. I often find myself stuck because I prefer novels in which the characters act and feel like characters from the past, whereas often I just find that the past is kind of a window dressing on modern characters. I will explain what I mean in a couple of moments, but I will say that I started off this historical fiction journey of mine to try to find something that I finally really liked with a failure, and that was Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. Oh my god, what a failure this one was. So this one, I'm sorry, this is not the like the nice pretty cover with the gothic architecture on it. This is the, I think, Star Series tie-in cover. I wouldn't spend money on the hardcover after this because I did not finish it. The Pillars of the Earth follows a stonemason whose life goal is to build a cathedral. But it's the Middle Ages and it's bad for most everybody involved. There is some intrigue going on with some of the unfortunate characters in here. There's like a mysterious woman who might have been a witch. It's so bog standard, and I started reading it, and I was like, why don't I like this? Because I like the Middle Ages, I study medieval architecture. Why don't I like this? It's because the characters were so boring, and the writing was so boring, and everything about it was so boring. I did end up looking at the plot synopsis on Wikipedia after I put this one down at 30% and decided, you know what, I don't need to read this. The beautiful descriptions of cathedrals wasn't enough to keep me interested, and so I will not finish this one. I gave it 1 star. Let's get the bad over with quickly. There's another novel that I DNF'd in the historical fiction category. That was this one, The Poe Shadow by Matthew Pearl. This is a novel which, by all rights, I should like. It's about a man who starts to investigate what he thinks was the murder of writer Edgar Allan Poe. Now, by all rights, I should have liked that. A little bit spooky, love some Poe, love a little bit of a thriller, now I'm finding out. But this one was just unfortunate because, again, Matthew Pearl could not, to me, bring to life any of the feelings that I wanted to get out of this novel. I wanted to be scared or thrilled or intrigued. I was mostly just bored by our wet sock main protagonist. I was never sure why this man, this fictional man, was so interested in Edgar Allan Poe. I was never able to figure it out because, by all rights, there's no reason he should be so interested, and so it just feels very inconsequential. When he starts getting in gunfights, it's like, you didn't have to be there. You didn't have to do this. I didn't like this one terribly much, and I ended up giving this one 1 star. A slightly more modern historical fiction novel that I picked up was Rules of Civility by Amar Tolls. This is a novel which follows a group of friends over the course of a calendar year in the 1930s in New York City. This one was written very very well. It was written beautifully. It was written in a way that was intriguing and interesting. The characters and the plot itself I found a little bit lackluster, but the writing really kept me interested, and I came away from it liking it, even if now I'm having trouble articulating what I liked about it. It didn't stick in my mind as much as I was perhaps hoping that it would, and so I give it 3.5 stars, probably 3 stars, um, bumped down from the 4 when I first read it. This next one I picked up because I read Rules of Civility. That was Amor Tolstoy's other novel, A Gentleman in Moscow. This is a novel that I was completely surprised by. It follows by a sort of script that you might have seen before of a man who has fallen from his aristocratic background. He's been put under house arrest in a hotel because of some political writing that he did before communism took over Russia. The thing is that this flips the script. It is not depressing, it is not sad, it is sometimes melancholic a little bit, but even then it is more a novel that is full of charm, full of life. He is now one of my favorite characters. I hope this gets some sort of adaptation soon. I would love to see him brought to life in the full screen, but even so, it's a character that I certainly will not be forgetting anytime soon, and I ended up giving this one 5 stars. Let's follow that one up real quick with a novel that I absolutely adored. That is this one, A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James. This is a chunky boy. This is a pretty long novel which follows a group of people who are kind of very loosely interconnected, I would say, as their lives are affected by the 1970s attempted assassination of Bob Marley. It goes from the, I guess I would call it the ghetto in Jamaica to the ghetto in New York City. It is a sprawling novel. It feels epic. But I'll say this is why I liked it. I liked this novel because of all the different perspectives that we follow in it, and we follow quite a few. We follow a CIA agent, we follow some gangsters, we follow a woman who might be pregnant, we follow so many different people in here, and none of them feel the same. They all have such distinct voices, you could never, ever in your life, I think, confuse them. If some people are put off by reading in dialect, I know that's not everybody's cup of tea. I will say that this one also has a really excellent audiobook that I listened to alongside reading this, and that was extremely helpful. What I will also say is that this is a violent novel. It is sexually violent, it is homophobically violent, it is just generally speaking murdery violent. It did not bother me while I was reading it because I know that this is own voices from a gay author, but I think that is worth saying, although I do hope that that will not chase you off because this is a truly remarkable book and I gave it 5 stars. This next one is interesting. This one is The Black Death, A Personal History by John Hatcher. John Hatcher is a professor at Cambridge, I believe? Yes, indeed, University of Cambridge, who wrote this novel in a sort of interesting way. So he taught medieval history, and while he was teaching medieval history, he was studying this particular small town in England in the 14th century, which was struck by the Black Plague. Now, there is only so much that we as historians can glean from some of the records that came from this town. And so what he has done instead is take what we do know, and there's quite a bit of history in here. Each chapter has a kind of preface. There's like some illustrative pictures in here, and then fills in the rest with a narrative so that you get a sense of what people in this town must have felt when the plague arrived, how their lives would have changed, how the rate of death would have changed. That, for me, is absolutely remarkable. If you're reading this for a literary reason, because you want to have great characters and a surprising plotline, I don't think this would do it for you. But if you're interested in kind of getting another perspective about how people felt in history, if you're coming at this from a historical point of view, I think you would really like it, and I'm giving it 4 stars. This next book is now one of my standards for great historical fiction, and that is this one, Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. Wolf Hall follows Thomas Cromwell at the court of Henry VIII. Cromwell is not an aristocrat, he is in fact an everyman based on a real person, Thomas Cromwell, and it follows him as he navigates all of the goings-on at the court of Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII's court is one of those time periods, especially in historical fiction, but also in period dramas and things like that I think is perhaps oversaturated. People apparently just can't get enough of the 6 wives of Henry VIII, etc. Now, what I will say is that I love this because it was so different, because as a man who could never have existed except during this time period, he feels like a man from Tudor England, and that to me is really remarkable that Hilary Mantel was able to bring this out. What I will say is that this is the first part of a trilogy. I have not read the second novel, although I am hoping to soon, and the third novel has just been announced. It should be released, I think, next year or the year after, but I think next year. I am really looking forward to it, and definitely look forward to me seeing what I think about the second novel in this series further in other videos on this channel. I give this one 5 stars. This next book was a recommendation by my mother. That is Anita Diamond's The Red Tent. Now, The Red Tent follows Dinah, who is a woman who is referenced in one passage in the Bible, and yet Anita Diamond has taken the time to spin out her story into a full and rich story about what it was like to live as one of the daughters of Jacob during this Old Testament period. What it was like to live in a strictly woman's world, the world of the Red Tent, and what her life story could have been like. This is a story that I was totally taken by surprise when I found out how much I liked it. I don't typically really resonate with characters whose entire personalities and lives resonate with the themes of motherhood and menstruation. It's just not something that I personally really like. I don't feel any sisterhood based on that. And so when I was reading this, I was so surprised at how emotional I got. By the end, I was crying. I don't typically cry when I read books, but this is certainly one that I did, and I would absolutely recommend this to anyone who's interested in historical fiction and wants to read something backlisted but still excellent. I gave this one 5 stars. Speaking of hyped books, I also read this next one, which is by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and that is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Now, this is a novel which follows a young reporter who has been tasked with writing an article about an Asian Hollywood star who's about to sell her dresses at a Sotheby's event, only to find out that Evelyn Hugo, this famous bombshell movie actress, has actually hired her, specifically requested her, so that Monique will be able to write her life story. Now, when I tell you this, I think that this is a pretty remarkable book. I thought that Evelyn Hugo was fascinating. I loved her story. I loved her perspective. I loved that she was pleasantly morally gray, and I really responded to that. What I will say is that this is a problem that I also had with Taylor Jenkins Reid's other novel, which I'll talk about in a second, is that the framing device of the reporter Monique coming and doing the interview was always the least interesting part of the book. I wish Taylor Jenkins Reid would just dispense with these framing devices and get into just writing historical fiction, which is something I think she's really excellent at. I give this one 5 stars. Alongside that, I next read Daisy Jones and the Six, also by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, this is a problem I had with the other one. So this one is told with the framing device that this is a band being interviewed for a kind of like retrospective oral history of their lives together, how they met, and then how they broke up. And I thought that the band members were really interesting, but again, the kind of framing device of it I thought was forced. I didn't particularly like it. I especially didn't like that there was kind of another twist, which was extremely reminiscent of The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo with regards to who the reporter is. I won't spoil it, but like, I wish it had been something else. I wish Taylor Jenkins Reid would, again, write just straight historical fiction. I think she'd be fantastic at it. Still, I didn't love this one as much as I thought I might. It reminded me of kind of watching trashy VH1 things while you're sick as a kid and whatever is left on the TV you end up watching, but I did end up giving this one 4 stars. So the other thing that I ended up reading this year that I thought was kind of interesting was this one, which is called Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. I picked this one up during January, which I thought would be the perfect time for it because it is such a grim, kind of cold-feeling novel. It takes place in the mid-19th century when the last woman in Iceland is publicly executed. It's based on a real story about this woman, and over time it unfolds why she is being executed, and then why that she committed this act. That, I think, is a very interesting character study. This is Hannah Kent's, I believe, debut novel. I do think she has such real promise. I love the way she made me feel like I was in Iceland in this kind of cold and extremely dirty peasant hut. I really loved that. However, some of her character choices, for me, I thought were a little bit questionable. During this novel, we follow this young woman. She is placed with a family to kind of be her jailers until she is executed. And during this time, she eventually develops a sort of rapport with the mother of this family, who initially really doesn't like that she has come to stay, but it's their feudal obligation. So I thought that that relationship was so interesting, how women are sometimes put in a position to make really questionable choices with regards to the men in their lives. I loved that parallel. Now, there's also another character that we follow who is this woman, the murderer's confessor. He is a wet blanket. He sucks. I didn't understand him. I didn't understand why he was there. He's pretty much just there to be like, oh, poor her. This is unfortunate. Really wish this weren't happening to her. I wish she would open up to me. She's real pretty. It was not for me. Didn't care for it. So, in the end, I would say I would recommend it, sort of, but mostly I'm just going to keep my eye out for anything else that Hannah Kent writes. I gave this one 3 stars. The last historical fiction novel that I'm going to talk about is this one, which is called The Gown by Jennifer Robson. Now, this follows 2 timelines in history. It follows, first, 2 young women who are placed at an embroidery factory to manufacture the gown that Elizabeth II would wear for her wedding day. The second is one of these women's granddaughter who is working in kind of contemporary times, and after her grandmother has died, she inherits a scrap of fabric and starts piecing the story together. The thing is that the idea of the gown, of the making of the gown, I thought was so interesting. I thought it would be so interesting to see what it was like to live in a time when everything was being rationed extremely in Britain, to be in a time when it was thought that something so extravagant could never have happened, and then to be involved in the making of something so particular. That I loved. I did not like the 3 extremely anemic romance plots that were just strung throughout the book. They're all kind of the same standard nice English gentleman goes and seduces and is respectable until one of them isn't, to make all the ladies fall in love with them. I didn't like it. I don't read a lot of romance. Perhaps that wouldn't be such a big deal to somebody else. So in the end, I can only give this one 3 stars. Again, love the premise of the gown. Don't care for the romance. There's also a sexual assault plotline in here. Thought that was worth mentioning. So in the end, I don't know. Maybe it'll be for you, but it really was not for me. I also found a couple of poetry collections this year. I struggle with some contemporary poetry. I suppose I'm a romanticist through and through. That's what I really like to read. However, there were some good ones and some not so good ones, so I'll talk about these kind of briefly. I do feel like it's almost impossible to get a sense of what a poetry collection is like unless you've read it yourself. So I'll start off with So Far So Good, which is a collection of Ursula K. Le Guin's last poems. This was not my favorite collection of poetry. I respect Ursula K. Le Guin as a writer, as an author, and she has some lines in her work that I think are beautiful and poetic. Unfortunately, when it came to this particular collection of poetry, there wasn't a lot in here that I could really resonate with, that I really thought was striking. And so in the end, I gave this one 3 stars. I also read Selected Poems by Margaret Atwood. This is a collection of Margaret Atwood's poems because, as I'll tell you in a couple of minutes, I read another Margaret Atwood this year that I loved. This one was pretty good. It feels very standard poetry feeling, I guess I would call it. There's some parts of it that I just felt like, yeah, that sounds like a poem, like about the nature of God and prayer and nature and stuff like that. Some of it was beautiful, some of it wasn't. I liked it more than the Ursula K. Le Guin collection, though, and so I gave that one 4 stars. I also read Dante Collins' Autopsy, which is a poetry collection which is about their experiences as a young queer black person. Now, I would recommend this to anybody who's looking for something a little bit different in their poetry, especially someone who likes something that's a little bit more evocative and powerful and kind of like punch you in the stomach kind of poetry. Especially, I think, for such a young poet, it's pretty remarkable. I gave it 4 stars. I will next talk about a collection of poetry that I liked so much that after I got it and had to return it to my library, I picked up my own copy. That is Field by Joss Charles. Now, this is a poetry collection which is unlike anything I have ever read before. I had to study literature in high school pretty extensively at a magnet school. I have read a lot of poetry. However, this one I think is truly just something different. It takes a almost early medieval laxness with grammar and spelling and uses it to describe Joss Charles's experiences as a trans woman. Now, I think that his poetry collection is just so different. It will not be for everyone, and I'm perfectly okay with that. But the images that are conjured in this one, I really do feel like are second to none. It is definitely now my favorite collection of contemporary poetry I have ever read. Please, please have a look at it. Lastly, I'll talk about another collection of poetry that I didn't respond to that well at all. This one was, this one was difficult. This is called The Mobius Strip Club of Grief by Bianca Stone. This is a collection of contemporary poetry which commits some of the cardinal sins for stuff that I don't like in poetry, but I will summarize what I didn't like about it by describing one poem. In this poem, our narrator reaches kind of self-actualization, like a vision of self, by watching an episode of the television program Supernatural. You can't just write poetry about that and think I'm not going to call you out on it. It is ridiculous. That does set the tone for the rest of the novel, or the rest of the poems, rather, where I was just flipping through going, really? Really? We're writing poetry about this now? We've run out of ideas and now this is what we're doing? I gave this one star. I thought it was absolutely ridiculous and I'm not sure I would recommend it. Next, I'm going to move right through to the kind of nebulous sci-fi dystopian category, and in that category I read another Margaret Atwood. Like I promised I'd tell you, that was this one, The Handmaid's Tale. This is a novel which is extremely well known. It follows a society of young women who has to live in a society in which women's reproductive freedom is extremely limited because of a combination of kind of religious extremism and a crisis of fertility. This is kind of disturbing. It's quite dark, but it is so powerful. I read this one, I was immediately reminded of one of my favorite novels of all time, which is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This is a novel which I would be thinking about forever, especially if you're interested in reproductive rights and health. I think this one is a kind of necessity that you read. I gave this one 5 stars. However, another sci-fi novel that I didn't get along with quite as well was George R. R. Martin's The Night Flyers. This is a novelist that you might probably know best from his series A Song of Ice and Fire, which was adapted into the Game of Thrones series. This is an older work of Martin's, I believe. It's quite a bit older than the Game of Thrones series, which is ongoing, presumably, if he ever finishes it. However, this one is a bog standard sci-fi novella. It follows a group of people who are off to find a mysterious alien race and make first contact with them, but they are going in a kind of smuggled ship, and immediately, pretty much, things are not as they seem. That being said, the way that I feel about it is that if you have read any sci-fi at all, if you've ever seen a sci-fi movie, you will immediately start to recognize some of the tropes in this one, and to me, it was just too many tropes, not enough original thinking. I ended up giving this one just 2 stars. I read all of one short story collection so far this year. That was this one, Ficciones by Jorge Luis Borges. This is a short story collection that I think is absolutely remarkable. As I typically do with things like short story or essay collections, I went through, after I read each short story, I ended up giving it a 1 out of 5 rating, and at the end I averaged them up. For this one, I got a completely solid 3. I got a 3 average rating. The thing is that in this collection, the short stories that I loved, that were so powerful, that were just stuck out of my mind, are now my favorite short stories of all time. There is some remarkable stuff in here. It is usually postmodern, it's speculative, it's science fiction, it's historical, it's allegorical, and it's so powerful and so interesting. So in the end, I ended up giving this one 4 stars just because the ones that I read, this was not a 3-star collection. This was definitely at least a 4 or 5-star collection for me, even if some of them just weren't my favorite. Definitely pick this one up if you're looking for short stories that are a little bit different than what you're used to. The next category that I will talk about is one that I don't read terribly often, that is young adult. Now, in the category of young adult, I have not always found things that I've enjoyed, but I picked up two of them just because the premises of them were so enjoyable and so interesting. The first that I'll talk about is Tomi Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone. This is a fantasy, beginning of a fantasy series, which follows a Nigerian-centered fantasy world in which a young woman is capable of making magic and wants to bring magic back because her kind of caste of people, I guess I would call them, who are traditionally the ones that do magic, have been oppressed for about 15 years. Now, the thing is that this is a well-written young adult fantasy, but it is the same young adult fantasy I have been reading since I was about 12 years old. There is very little that is new here except for the Nigerian setting. I was hoping that with that setting change, there would be something different in the way that the story was structured, that it would kind of pull out something new, maybe from, Nigerian folktale archetypes or something that I could really get my teeth into that would be different. However, it's pretty much, if you have ever read a fantasy novel about a young woman who's capable of doing magic and has to overthrow an evil king, you have read this one before. You have also read this strange love dynamic that there is in this book before. So, if that being said, I think it is extremely important for representation that people are able to see themselves in the same stories that I have been privileged enough to see myself in for such a long time. It's been a long time since I was 12 years old. And therefore, I think I would recommend it to somebody who is looking for a new young adult fantasy series if that's something that you know that you like and enjoy. Personally, I think I've just outgrown it a little bit, and so I only gave this one 3 stars. I also read Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. This is a slam poem, kind of novella, which follows a young man who is attempting to extract vengeance for an act of gang violence and go and murder somebody. But he is trapped in the longest elevator ride of all time as all manner of strange, previously deceased people start getting on the elevator. I don't want to spoil it too much, but it is a really heartfelt and powerful poem which talks a lot about addressing the cycles of gang violence and especially young male on male violence. And so, for that reason alone, I would recommend it. The slam poetry itself, the structure of it, is also extremely good, and I gave this one 4 stars. The next category that I'm going to talk about is one that I found myself absolutely falling in love with because of one particular book. The category is thriller, suspense, mystery, that kind of nebulous, multi-genre, and the book is this one. That is The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. Now, this is a novel which follows a young man who finds himself waking up in the body of a different guest at a particular house party every day for a week, and every day in this house party at the same time, this young woman named Evelyn Hardcastle dies. And so he has to either solve the mystery or save her using these different perspectives and lives of these people at the party. Now, this is so interesting. It's very Agatha Christie, very murder house, but it's got that speculative element of you wondering how and why is this man waking up in all these different perspectives, and how is he going to get out? And so this one absolutely gripped me. I would not shut up about this one after I had read it. I gave this one 5 stars, and I think it is well worth the read. Now, I had never read any Agatha Christie before this year, and the reason that I knew that the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle was almost Agatha Christie-esque is because I gave it to my dad to make him read it, and that is what he said about it. And so I thought, ooh, might as well pick up some Agatha Christie. I started with The Murder on the Orient Express, which is one of the Hercule Poirot mysteries, which is interesting because even though I knew the concept of it, because it's one of those mystery novels that is so archetypal and so common and so popular that you just learn about it kind of through cultural osmosis, I still found myself really enjoying it all the way through. I have found that what I really like in mysteries is mysteries that are not so heavy on the action and are more kind of mental mysteries in which you have to figure out, perhaps on your own, who has done this kind of murder, like a thought exercise, like Sherlock Holmes, the old Sherlock Holmes stories. But in this case, I really found myself enjoying it even when it was explained to me at the end. So I guess I'm just a classic mystery kind of gal. Now, because I read that one and I gave it 4 stars. I then picked up And Then There Were None. And Then There Were None, I read, which is the classic murder house mystery story. If you've ever read a novel in which people go into a house and start to die and everyone has to figure out what's going on, it's like this one. I was all set to give this one 5 stars. It was suspenseful, it was interesting, it was creepy and I guess I would say well set in a way that was really evocative. And then I read the backstory on Wikipedia, which I'd never heard anybody talk about. I would recommend you read it if it's not something that you know about the original title of this book and the racism. So I was all set to give this one 5 stars. I ended up not rating it. I don't think I will read another Agatha Christie, if I'm honest with you. Moving on from that, I'll talk about Samantha Downing's My Lovely Wife, which is a thriller that I enjoyed so much that I'm not going to tell you too terribly much about it, except what I heard when I first knew I had to pick it up. That is that this is a novel which focuses on a couple whose sexual fetish, how they spice things up in the bedroom, is to murder people. And that was so interesting to me. I picked it up, read through it immediately, gave it 4 stars because I thought it was a lot of fun. And so I hope that if that premise sounds interesting to you, you will also pick it up because it's well worth the read. Next, I'll talk about Hong Kong's The Vegetarian. This is a South Korean novel which has been translated and which follows a young woman who has converted to vegetarianism because of a dream that she had. The novel follows her story through the eyes and perspectives of other members of her family. This is not really a novel about vegetarianism. I saw some reviews on Goodreads that are like, this is how I feel as a vegan, persecuted every day. It's not about that. The novel is actually about how a young woman's bodily autonomy is taken away by her family because of her bizarre choices, and the limits of freedom of the self when it comes to a behavior that is destructive. This novel feels psychological to the point of being almost magical realism, almost fantasy, almost horror, like supernatural horror. It is gripping. It is so powerful. I really do hope you give it a read. I give this one 4 stars. Next, I read Oyen Kang Brahuate's My Sister the Serial Killer. This is an extremely short novel again, which follows a young woman who has to clean up after her sister commits murders. I really had higher expectations for this novel, unfortunately. The thing is that because of its brevity and because of its length, it struggled with the fact that I wanted just so much more out of it. I wanted more out of the characters, I wanted more out of the plot, I wanted more development, but there wasn't the room. I gave this one 2 stars in the end because my expectations were so high and it just struggled so much. I'm not sure if I'm missing something. Like, I think the New York Times book review called it hilarious, and I didn't find it hilarious at all. So maybe it's just me. I would love to know your comments down below if you have read this one and also found yourself as kind of baffled by its extremely popular reception like I did. Next, I will talk about another thriller novel with an interesting concept that I can't give away too much. That is this one, The Wife Between Us by Greer Hendricks and Sarah Buchanan. This is a novel which follows a family during a divorce, sort of. And I can't give away too much besides that because it would give away this novel, which is so focused on twists and turns. The plot synopsis of it is something like assume nothing. Yeah, when you read this book, you will make many assumptions. You will assume you are reading about a jealous ex-wife. You will assume she is obsessed with her replacement, a beautiful younger woman who's about to marry the man they both love. You will assume you know the anatomy of this tangled love triangle. Assume nothing. That's a little dramatic, but this is still pretty good. But I will say that this novel is so full of twists and turns, it can be a little bit confusing at times. But that being said, if you're interested in thrillers, perhaps if you've not read too many of them, I'm not sure how kind of well-trod this ground is, really, but I was surprised by how much I really, really enjoyed this one, and I gave it 4 stars. The next one that I read was The Water Cure by Sophie MacIntosh. This one was billed to me as kind of the next Handmaid's Tale because it is about a society of young women who live in an almost dystopian level of fear about encountering men and about what men will do to them. It is an extrapolation of purity culture about the idea that when a young woman has a sexual encounter with a man, in this novel, any encounter with a man, she is contaminated. And so this one is horrifying in some ways. It really is. These women go through quite a lot. That being said, I really wish I felt stronger about it. The thing about this novel is that for some reason, while I was reading it, I really struggled with the fact that I wasn't feeling the tension because when the men show up, because of course the men show up, uh, it didn't feel really like a huge change. It felt inevitable, and a lot of this novel feels inevitable rather than surprising. I ended up giving this one 2 stars. I wish I could rate it higher, but that's just ended up how I felt about it. Next, I will talk about one of the books that I read because it was a Goodreads Choice Award winner, and that tells me everything I need to know about the Goodreads Choice Awards. That is Stephen King's Elevation, which won in the horror category. Despite not being a horror novel, not being sold as a horror novel, it really just tells you everything you need to know about how disrespected horror is as a genre, I guess. The thing about this novel is that it follows a man whose body is remaining the same, and he remains his kind of portly middle-aged self, but his weight is dropping and he feels lighter. And so his body does not reflect what is happening to him, and so it feels very supernatural. And as his weight goes down, 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 he feels like there's a ticking time bomb, and he wants to know what will happen when his weight reaches 0. The scariest thing about this novel to me was how this man talked about the hot bod of his lesbian neighbor. It was gross. It was very weird. I didn't like it. I gave this 1 star. I would be happy not to read any more Stephen King after this, but I know I shouldn't judge all of Stephen King by the standards of one novel. It's just, I wish this one had been better. The next novel that I read was We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, in which 2 sisters unfortunately struggle from being socially ostracized because their family, almost all of their family, had been murdered at a dinner that they were having, and the older sister has gone on trial for it. This is a postmodern horror novel. Shirley Jackson is probably most well known for The Haunting of Hill House, which is a novel that I also hated, and so I'm not sure why I was surprised when I hated this one as well. The thing is that if you take away, if you're judging a horror novel and it doesn't scare you, there has to be something else. There has to be something else to redeem it and make it good literature, a good book, a good read. There was nothing in this one for me. I thought that the characters were unlikable and confusing and kind of ridiculous. I thought that the plot was extremely predictable and kind of silly, and it just never felt like there was anything at stake because you could always tell what was going to happen. I gave this one 1 star. Next, I'll talk about Ruth Ware's The Woman in Cabin 10. This is a mystery novel in which a young woman has to go on a cruise ship because she's a journalist, has to report on this cruise ship, this luxury liner, and she is convinced that her neighbor in the cabin next to hers has been murdered. But everybody else tells her that there has never been anybody in that cabin. It is a thriller concept that I really enjoyed, and seemingly this is the problem with thrillers for me, is when I really enjoy the idea and not the execution, because this one was just kinda strange. I don't know if there were supposed to be a ton of red herrings, or if there are a ton of loose ends that are never tied up in it. It's a very convenient novel. It jumps around a little bit too much in time and space for me, so I never felt like I was getting a sense of who this character was. Her personality also fluctuates quite a bit back and forth. I gave this one, I think, 3 stars at the time. It's kind of just average for me, but I would love to see this concept, murder on a cruise ship, isolated environment, away from police officers. I would love to see something like that in the future done extremely well. The last novel that I'm going to talk to you about in this fiction video is this one, If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. This is a dark academia campus novel affair in which a group of friends who are Shakespeare acting theater majors, I guess, have to cover up the fact that they did a very bad, they did a murder. So the grip of this novel is if you like Shakespeare, and and if you like the idea of characters talking in Shakespearean quotes at each other like no human does, if you like that, you will probably like this. You will also like this if you like the secret history and just want that again. The thing is that ML Rio, I like the way that she writes. Unfortunately, I don't like the secret history, and I didn't want to read it again. This is, at times, point by point, the secret history. And so I gave this one 3 stars. I would like to see something new and fresh from ML Rio that isn't such well trodden ground. And there you have it. Those are the fiction books, and I guess some poetry as well, that I've read so far in 2019. I hope you enjoyed all these little micro reviews. If there are any of these books in particular that you would like to hear me talk about, please do let me know in the comments down below. I'll be writing some longer form reviews and hopefully posting them on this channel in the very near future. I'll also be doing another component of this video, which is the non-fiction books, and I hope you will also look for that one as well. It should be uploaded at the same time as this one, and so I will link them both down below, where you can also find all of the books that I've talked about in this video linked as well. Thank you very much for watching. Bye!